The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been going on for over 2 months now, but the tensions between the two countries have been going on for decades. In this video, I'm going to dive deep into the history between the two countries and uncover the truth behind what started the Russian invasion. It all started in 1991, when the Soviet Union split and Russia lost control of Ukraine. Ukraine was a danger to the rest of the world because, at the time, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and they just gained independence. To prevent any volatile regrets, there was a large effort to denuclearize Ukraine. Russia worked with the US to eventually get Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security and assurance that Russia would not attack. This boded well for Ukraine, as the denuclearization fueled new relationships with Europe, US, and other countries all around the world. By the end of the 90s, Ukraine had been one of the top recipients for US assistance, and in 1997, Ukraine and NATO conceived the NATO-Ukraine Council and agreed to a distinctive partnership. In 2014, tensions started rising significantly when several regions of Ukraine tried to claim independence from the Ukrainian government, known as the Maidan Revolution. Russia has backed and supported the separatists, and experts say that this was likely setting the stage for a larger conflict in the future. Soon after, these tensions led Russia to occupy parts of eastern Ukraine when the separatist regions were and annexed Crimea for a small period. But Russia's efforts to fuel the movement fell short when Ukraine's government stepped in. At the time, Ukraine had a pro-Russian president named Viktor Yanukovych, who stepped out of multiple European trade deals. Yanukovych supported the pro-Russian rebellion inside of Ukraine and helped the movement gain more traction. Although the Maidan Revolution started and ended in 2014, there was still a tug-of-war for control of some regions throughout Ukraine known as the Donbas regions. Since 2014, fighting has not ceased completely since it started, and it is the root of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. When the Soviet Union split and lost control of Ukraine in 1991, Ukraine split into two political parties. A pro-Russian and a pro-European group was established, the same groups that started fighting in 2014. Since Ukraine's independence, the pro-European side of the country has attempted to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO, and the pro-Russian side has attempted to claim independence from Ukraine and join Russia. Russia's strategy to fuel the pro-Russian movement in Ukraine was also in part motivated by the prevention of Ukraine joining NATO. Since 1991, NATO has given a lot of aid to Ukraine, and Ukraine actually became a NATO partner in 1994, but is technically not a NATO member, meaning they do not have the same security guaranteed that NATO members do, but they still receive peacekeeping aid. In 2020, the new pro-European president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, approved a new national security strategy, which had a focus on a distinctive partnership with NATO, with the end goal of becoming a member of NATO. This raised tensions between the pro-European and pro-Russian parties, and Russia also did not agree with the national security strategy. Nearly a year and a half later, in the final months of 2021, you can see satellite footage of Russia starting to advance forces towards Ukraine's borders, with Russia focusing on Crimea as their main target. This was not a small amount of forces either. Russia moved an entire army towards Ukraine, consisting of tanks, vehicles, artillery, and much more. Spectators knew something bigger was starting. Russia knew if it wanted continuous influence and power over Ukraine, and more power throughout Europe, they could not let them join NATO, and Russia knew they would have to use force to get their way. After Russia mobilized its troops to Ukraine's borders, tensions started rising significantly. The world knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know what or when. Putin was under the impression that Ukraine's government was fragile and would crumble easily. Once the political system fell, taking over cities would be significantly easier for Russia. So they invaded strategic areas and targeted political figures to bring down the fall of the Ukrainian government. To Putin's surprise, the Ukrainians fought back much stronger than anticipated, and their government has remained intact to this day, even through Russia's first and strongest attempts. I would argue a great deal of Ukrainians' continued strength can be due to the President Zelensky's actions during this time of crisis. The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has a more interesting story than most political figures. Zelensky was actually born in Ukraine when the country was still a part of the Soviet Union, so he was technically born in the USSR. In 2000, he graduated from Kyiv National Economic University with a law degree, and although he did have a law degree, he worked in a Ukrainian film studio for 14 years and continued to work in television. In 2015, Zelensky was cast in a TV show known as Servant of the People. His role was as a history teacher that would eventually become president through his anti-corrupt views. This show was a massive hit in Ukraine, especially considering the government was corrupt beyond belief at the time. Evidently, the show spelled out a similar roadmap for Zelensky. The 2019 election was on its way and Zelensky wanted in. He immediately emerged as a frontrunner. Within the first round of votes, Zelensky had won over 30% of the votes, towering above all of his opponents, and won the actual election with a 73% of the vote, leaving only 20% for his opponent. It was clear that Ukraine was ready for an anti-corrupt, pro-European president to take office. Through the Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Zelensky has earned global acclaim and respect from nations across the globe. With Russia attempting to prevent Ukraine becoming a NATO member, they were also protecting their borders to Europe. As Ukraine shares thousands of miles of border with both Russia and European countries. If Ukraine did join NATO, Russia would lose the buffer between themselves and Europe, instantly becoming more vulnerable to Europe than ever. On February 21st, 2022, just days before the official invasion, Putin announced his recognition of the independent states of Ukraine and sent peacekeeping troops to the separatist regions. In response, Zelensky televised a plea directly to Russia asking for peace. As a response to that, on February 24th, Russia announced a special military operation and began raining down missiles upon Ukraine. This special military operation announced the beginning of the Russian invasion, and Putin started to send hundreds of thousands of troops to occupy strategic regions of Ukraine. After this unprovoked attack, Zelensky attempted to rally the international community. Zelensky was the face of the resistance against Russia, and Zelensky capitalized on his background in entertainment. As an answer to Zelensky's call for help, Western forces flooded Ukraine with all kinds of military equipment and set up sanctions against Russia, essentially being cut off from the rest of the world. As NATO writes on their website, in a matter of weeks, President Putin has destroyed decades of economic progress for the Russian people, and Russia has now been hit by a near total isolation on the world stage. President Putin's decision to attack Ukraine is a terrible strategic mistake for which Russia will pay a heavy price, both economically and politically, for years to come. It is clear the world is on Ukraine's side, as Putin has consequently embarrassed himself to Russia and the rest of the world.